If I had to pick the zenith of American automotive design, I would say it's definitely the 1960s, and that's something that Jeep has taken to heart in designing this new generation Grand Cherokee, because this is inspired by the Wagoneer of the 1960s and American luxe of the past, because when Americans do luxury, they do it well. And this vehicle here, the Grand Cherokee L 7-seater, is a tremendously good example of that. This Grand Cherokee L is an important car for Jeep because it is the first all-new vehicle launched since they became part of the Stellantis group. It is also built in a brand new factory in Detroit, the first new factory in that city in 30 years, and it launches in a 3-row 7-seater with a long wheelbase, which is not only the first for a Grand Cherokee, but also means it's kind of the most important model in this new generation of vehicle. A 5-seat one will be launching in Australia in early 2023, but I think this is actually the star of the show. It is quite a lot longer than the 5-seat and actually has its completely own unique style, although at the front here and all of this stuff is all shared with the 5-seat model and, like I said, inspired a little bit by the past. This 7-slot grille stands upright and actually leans a little bit forward, very much like a Jeep of the 1960s, yet it does a really neat example of integrating all of the technology. We've got a camera hidden in here, the front parking sensor and the camera here. It sort of cleanly incorporates the front and gives it that sort of clean luxe style. This is very much a 1960s style of American luxe where they were rejecting the over-embellishment of the past and keeping the design clean. And even though this is the Summit Reserve, which is the absolute top spec Grand Cherokee L, $115,000 worth of it, mind you, and it has 21-inch wheels and it has a bit of chrome and all that sort of stuff, but it is really quite a subtly designed vehicle. The shape of the Grand Cherokee L is substantially different from the 5-seat. It has its completely own window line, completely different upper back end treatment, a longer rear door, and has a 3,091mm wheelbase on a 5.2 metre long car. This is a 7-seater in its finest, largest form. It's a proper 7-seater. It's not just a 5+2. This is about being big. And in fact, the Grand Cherokee L is actually a lot about numbers as well, you know, from the 21-inch wheels to the 276mm of ground clearance that this car can have, because this Summit Reserve here has adaptive air suspension, which means it can lift up and lift down. There's a lot going on in here. Even in the boot, this is a huge, capacious 7-seater. Underpinning the Grand Cherokee L is a platform that Jeep says is 96% new. I don't know where the other 4% necessarily comes from. Some suggest it's the Giorgio platform from Alfa Romeo, but this is essentially its own new platform. It has multi-link front suspension, multi-link independent back suspension, aluminium suspension arms and knuckles. There's a lot of technology underneath this car to make it really ride quite beautifully, as we'll discover in this adaptive air suspension model. Now, the Summit Reserve here has a few own unique styling details. It does the color coding around the wheel arches and along the sills. It has a floating black roof that's just black on this model to separate it from the Limited and the Night Eagle below it. But I think unlike cars like the new Compass, where the color coding looks a bit sort of like yesterday's car, in this car here, the Summit Reserve, which does sound a little bit like it might be a case of wine, it probably should come with a case of wine, definitely looks like it should go to wine country. These wheels and that sort of embellishment give it a real sense of presence and class. Compared to, say, a BMW X7, I think the Jeep Grand Cherokee L looks way better, but let us know what you think. Would you choose a Jeep over a posh BMW just because it was so much more handsome? I probably would, especially once you've driven it. There's definitely a look of expense for the Grand Cherokee L. Even these 21-inch wheels here with 275/45 R21 Continental cross contact tyres. They're a high quality SUV tyre on this car. And just the shape of the back of the Grand Cherokee L, I think it looks a lot classier than the forthcoming 5-seater. I love the way the black roof, especially on this silver Summit Reserve here, it looks really good on a white one as well. Just having this black roof, the chrome around the edge, this sort of polished panel along the roof rails there, just the extension of the rear end and the longer back door gives this car a presence and a stance. And we know it's not a car because it's a 5.2 metre long four-wheel drive. But at the back here too, just the slitty lights running into the tailgate, just it has a level of cleanliness that isn't always associated with a Grand Cherokee, in my opinion, although you may think otherwise. Perhaps this lower bar area is probably a little bit over-designed. I don't know about the exhaust outlets and the panel and that section and the tow bar bit and all that, but You know, let us know what you think. If you don't like it, just buy the model below, which is the Limited, which costs $88,000, and then the Night Eagle that starts at just under $83,000. So this 115K spec Summit Reserve is really way beyond the base models. Although even the base version of this Grand Cherokee L has an electric tailgate like this one. So it's not exactly doing it tough. This just has a lot of stuff, and most of it is inside. As for the sizing of the Grand Cherokee L, it is pretty huge. Jeep doesn't actually quote boot measurements based upon the window line or the luggage cover, but you don't need to look very deeply to realize there's a lot. There's 487 litres from here to here behind this third row. We've got this little reversible mat here with carpet on one side, rubber on the other. We've got a little panel underneath the floor with some storage here and a plasticized thing, which is good for wet stuff. We've also got a full-size steel spare underneath the back end of this vehicle, and we have the remnants of the stereo in this car, which is a 19-speaker Macintosh. So we've got 2 speakers in the tailgate here for your little tailgate party. We've got the subwoofer in the back left over here, and we have electric buttons to put all of these seats down. So to put the third row down, just push that and push the right one, and they slowly but neatly transform 487 litres to 1,328 litres behind the middle row. And if you put the middle row down, which we can also do by pushing that and that is nearly 2,400 litres of space. This is a proper full-size SUV. Now, even the entry-level Grand Cherokee L Night Eagle, which is $82,950, has stuff like standard leather seats. It has 8-way electric front adjustment with seat heating. It has the 10.25-inch digital driver's display. It has wireless charging hidden in here, and it has an 8.4-inch screen. Whereas this Summit Reserve and the Limited below it lifts that to a new level. This is really a stunning level of luxury, I think, certainly for a Jeep and certainly for an American car in modern times. It kind of blends an element of cohesion and restraint, which is not what you would always expect. Perhaps not completely to a European level, but then it also still has an American flavour about it. In the Summit Reserve, that starts with this waxed walnut wood that runs along the dash here, curves up into the screen here, which Jeep made a bit of an issue about to sort of prove that it's cohesive, runs along the door here, along the edges of the dash here, and it's rimmed by this sort of silverish panel that has a brushed end that says since 1941 and a little Easter egg on the end, according to Jeep, to show the subtlety of the car. Although we do have Summit written in massive lettering on the back of the seat here, so not quite to the level of restraint that I would personally like. The rest of it is, though, really nice. This one here is black Palermo leather, which is the Summit Reserve one. There is another option that's called Tupelo, which is named after a honey that a lot of people like. I personally don't love it. It doesn't quite match the waxed walnut, in my opinion. I much prefer this dark coloured one where the stitching matches the wood and the stitching is everywhere. It's quilted on the sides of the seats, it's up along the edge of the panel here, through this padded section in the dash and padded dash top, down the doors here, more quilting in the doors. It's around the steering wheel boss in the center here, and we've got more wood on the wheel here. In fact, I really love the Grand Cherokee L's wheel shape. It's kind of nicely chunky, but not overly so. I like the way it's dished. To me, it has a real element of sort of retro modernity about it. As for the modern stuff in here, there's a lot going on, but it is sort of nicely integrated. Piano black is everywhere, so if you don't like that, well then probably don't buy the Grand Cherokee L Summit Reserve. But it is classy and nice. Even this circular gear lever here, which is currently not turning because the ignition's not on, has a real feeling of solidity about it. This is not some flimsy looking piece of tat. It's actually feels like metal, has all patterning around the side, which they made a point about being very sci-fi. All of the switch gear is really easy to locate. Here we've got the drive mode controls. In this case with the adaptive air, we've also got rock, which the other ones don't have, and the suspension height adjustment over here. And we have four drive low, which is not on the Night Eagle and the Limited. And we have hill descent control here. So underneath the center panel here, we also have wireless charging, which is weirdly an option on the Summit Reserve because it's packaged in a $5,500 technology pack that also includes a head-up display and night vision. And from the MY22 build, we'll have a passenger screen built here into the dash, which this one doesn't have. The other two models do have wireless charging as standard, so I think Jeep expects everybody to be optioning that. Part of that is having wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto in this case, and in the Limited below it with a 10.1-inch screen here that is just beautifully luxe. It is so much nicer than the old Uconnect systems. This is Uconnect 5, I think, now for this generation. It even has things like here where you can hit the top right here and it brings up the seat heating and cooling, but you can also do that with a button down here in the HVAC to bring up the heating and cooling there. So you've got two options. It's nice and seamless. It works really quickly. I just think it's a really nice system. Here we go. We can drop the third row headrests. We have the surround view camera. There's a family cam where you can hit the thing and it'll actually point on people in the car to monitor what they're doing, make sure they're not watching illicit videos on their iPads perhaps. I don't know. I would never let that as a parent. And there's meant to be 12 outlet ports. There's a big deal about connectivity in here. We've got USB-A and USB-C plugs here, plus a 12-volt outlet, plus an auxiliary cord, and it keeps getting repeated as it goes back. So this is all about kind of satisfying everyone in the family, not just the person in this seat here. But for the driver here, we do have really quite a lot of comfort. These seats in the Summit Reserve are 12-way electric. They have adjustable under thigh extenders. They have seat massaging, so when you hit the button up here, it brings up waterfall, lower back, extend, low extend, rock climb on low, medium or high, like a whole bunch of different settings to play around with it. I personally don't like seat massaging, but a lot of people do. Even little details like the fact that the front passenger door has a lock and unlock button, which is usually hidden somewhere on the dash or only on the driver's door. There's just a little bit of intelligence in here. Now, this Summit Reserve also has stuff like this suede lining along the A-pillars and across the roof. It has a standard dual pane sunroof that's optional on other models, and crowning the audio quality, the mid-level Limited has a 9-speaker Alpine system that's really good, but this one has a 19-speaker Macintosh system that is an American audio brand. It has Macintosh written up here. It has Macintosh in the doors that light up in blue. Yeah, 19 speakers, 760 watt amplifier, plus a subwoofer. It is really good. And it doesn't have an excess of equalizer crap going on in here either. It's just a fairly simple treble and bass, surround sound on or off, let it do its own thing and let it roar basically. It works really well too because the Grand Cherokee L is actually a really quiet car, so it gives it the perfect stage. As for the driver's stage, the driving position is really good. The steering wheel is pretty much centered. We have full electric column adjustment, and just looking out over the bonnet, you can still see the bonnet, and even though I know it's almost flat, it doesn't actually feel like it's too intrusive. You've got a great view out across this lovely dash, out down the side. This glassiness is again something that Jeep wanted to bring back about 1960s design. And we're never going to get to that point where we had super thin pillars and pillarless sides, but this brings an element of that back, a significant element of that back. The middle row in the Grand Cherokee L continues that sort of vision story, where here I've just got this beautiful massive sunroof above me. I've got quite a low window line. I'm sitting higher than the seat in front, even though that's as low as it'll go. And I've still got a bit of toe room, tons of knee room, and pretty good foot room and leg room. Relatively flat transmission tunnel in the center here, and a really quite comfortable seat. It's not overly massive and it's not overly plush, nowhere near as plush as the front, but the under thigh in here is really good. It's way better packaged than the previous 5-seat Grand Cherokee. I suppose we are in the long wheelbase, so that's what you'd expect. And that's why I have these lovely long doors and this sort of sense of elegance. Now, the Summit Reserve is one of the few vehicles I know to actually have fan cooling for the rear seat as well. So we've got 3-setting fan cooling there, 3-setting heating. We've also got 4-zone climate control for the rear seat here, with these 2 vents in here, sitting above another pair of USB-A and USB-C ports, plus a 230 volt, 150 watt, 3-prong outlet in the middle there, nicely concealed away. And these blend with another pair of air vents in the B pillars to give a lot of ventilation for these people in this middle row. We also have these neat little map pockets here, fairly small door pockets. You can only get a 600ml bottle in there. You can't get the camping bottle that you can get into the front doors. It just won't fit there. It lies sideways. There is another pair of cup holders in the center here in this really nicely trimmed and sort of nicely quality feeling center armrest here. And the seat itself, it has the same diamond quilting and perforation on the outside. The perforation obviously because you have the seat cooling, but we also have fore aft adjustment. So this goes, wow, it goes a long way forward. That's all the way forward. That's all the way back. We also have a lever on the side to do the backrest adjustment, which goes kind of from fairly upright to all the way down here, and a pretty easy seat fold mechanism which starts from over the side here. Now these headrests in the back don't do what the fronts do, where they have this sort of infinite level of tilt, more than 10 positions there, but it's a pretty good place to be. I would very happily enjoy the refinement and the ride quality and the comfort of this Summit Reserve while hearing someone crank some pretty good music on that stereo. And while we're here, one last thing, not only do we have these cool manual blinds in the doors, these don't need to be electric, but we also have the lock and unlock button on the rear back doors as well. So it's a little detail that makes it a little bit more useful. Now, getting into the third row of the Grand Cherokee L has a little bit of theatre because I like the way the seat kind of lifts and does that, which is pretty cool. Does help you get in pretty easily. You do have to have someone adjust the base when you come back because it does lock into place kind of there. But when I'm here, I've got this really quite good seat. The same trim as everywhere else, so it's perforated Palermo leather with the diamond quilting and the stitching and all that sort of stuff, and a really great view. I'm 5'10", behind the sunroof. I've got that much amount of headroom. I've got air vents here in the C-pillars. We've got more portage going on, USB-A and USB-C for both sides of the back. Both people have a cup holder here. Now the seat adjustment in the back is fixed, but it's still in a pretty good position. You do have buttons on both sides of the rear here to be able to flop a seat down. So if I want the left one to go, push that, and down she goes. And there's a couple of little Easter eggs, probably more subtle in this Jeep than other ones. We've actually got here the silhouette of the 7-seat Grand Cherokee L driving behind the yet to go on sale 5-seat Grand Cherokee, well, yet to go on sale in Australia. The combined fuel consumption figure for the Jeep Grand Cherokee L is 10.6 litres per 100 kilometres, drinking 95 octane premium unleaded. However, we've averaged 11.5 litres per 100 kilometres. The warranty for Jeep in Australia is 5 years or 100,000 kilometres, whereas the recommended servicing is every 12 months or 12,000 kilometres, with the 5-year cap price amount being $1,995. Over the past 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $1,365 to comprehensively insure a Jeep Grand Cherokee. However, everybody's situation is different and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, your driving history, and whether you garage your car. Now, aside from the obvious safety benefits of having full-time four-wheel drive, and in the Summit Reserve's case, adaptive air suspension with low range as well, the Grand Cherokee L does tick pretty much every safety box. Rear cross traffic alert with blind spot monitoring, it has highway assist, adaptive cruise control on all models, AEB with pedestrian and cyclist detection, lane assist, all that stuff. It is easy to turn the lane assist off. You just press this button here twice on top of the center stack here, rather than having to scroll through the rather pretty systems in the Uconnect 5. So that does make things quite easy. The cruise control buttons are just on the steering wheel here. Again, really easy, not capacitive, just buttons with piano black on top. That makes that nice and simple. The Americans are good at making things easy for user interface, and this is very much of that ilk. Not that I can get the center screen in front of me to get all the views that I've seen on other cars that I've driven today, but it is nicely configurable, and I'm sure once you spend a bit of time doing it, you can have a bit of a play around, and it does match in with the general look of the interior, which gives the Grand Cherokee L Summit Reserve in particular a level of expense. Now, probably the weakest point of the car is the drivetrain, and yet it isn't bad at all. It's just that it's a 3.6 litre petrol V6. It doesn't have a turbocharger, it doesn't have any fancy electrification. It has been calibrated and refined to within an inch of its life. So 210 kilowatts at 6,000 RPM, 344 Newton meters at a fairly high 4,000 RPM, an 8-speed automatic that again is really well calibrated and does wring the best out of the engine. To do so though, it does rev quite a lot. It has had a lot of refinement in terms of the suppression of the engine from the cabin, so while you can hear it thrashing away, it isn't really a thrashy sound like it has been in the past with this Pentastar V6 and other American petrol V6s. It does sound relatively keen and reasonably smooth. It revs to sort of like 6,600 RPM, so it isn't a slow engine, certainly on the flat. It does struggle a little bit going up fairly steep inclines. I imagine with 5 or 7 people in it, if you wanted to overtake when an overtaking lane opens up, you'll need to be in the right gear, probably have this in sport mode, and to have your right foot absolutely mashed to the floor, because I think overall torque isn't the engine's forte, even though the efficiency isn't too bad. It does work really quite well off-road though, especially in this one with 4-wheel drive low, because you do have 8 ratios, and it does fill in the gaps that the torque doesn't really have. You may be able to hear it down changing in the background there. It's not an unpleasant engine, it's just that I feel like the 5.7 Hemi that's available in the US would better suit this vehicle, but then also that's not the greatest Hemi either. That's the 6.4, and that's not available in this car. So perhaps in the future, as this electrification rollout happens, the Grand Cherokee L will get the drivetrain it deserves. So for now, the 3.6 V6 is adequate and inoffensive, but not anywhere near class leading. Where this Grand Cherokee L does elevate itself though is in terms of the refinement. We're on 21-inch wheels here. We're driving over a pretty bumpy country road. I can hear a little bit of hum in the background, but this is a really quiet vehicle. It doesn't have very much wind noise. It suppresses road noise really well, and it just has a quite surprising level of ride absorbency on pretty much all surfaces. Where on the second from bottom suspension ride height, it does adjust itself over a fairly broad range. I think it's close to 80 millimeters. And so leaving that level of adaptiveness in the handling of the Summit Reserve does sort of gift it a level of sophistication in the way that it drives. The steering, it's 11.7 meter turning circle, which isn't too big for a car that's as big as this. 2.8 turns lock to lock. It is really quite sharp off center. If you can see the car moving here, just as I turn it off there, it doesn't have a whole lot of feel there. It is quite heavy-ish when you're parking and quite light when you're hustling it, even in sport mode down there. But there's just a level of keenness that adds this agility to the Grand Cherokee L that's most surprising, especially when you consider how high up you're sitting, because I really am really quite high. We're driving behind a Compass, and I'm much taller than that vehicle. I've got a fantastic view, and yet underneath me I have quite an accomplished chassis that when you get into corners that are sort of marked sort of 65 kilometers an hour and stuff, and you start to acclimatize to the way the Grand Cherokee L drives, because it isn't brimming with feel. It is a car that you sort of get used to its sort of keenness in corners. You can feel the back end come into play. Perhaps it's the weight of the paneling in the rear of the car, because we are on a long wheelbase one here with all of that extra metal hanging off the end, but it does bode well for the 5-seat version, and it certainly is a reasonably fun large SUV to drive, very large SUV to drive. For doing what we're doing here, bombing along a country road, doing 100-ish because it's limited to 100, and having this lovely view around, this is the Grand Cherokee L's forte. We're not far from snow country in New South Wales, and I can totally imagine a vehicle like this doing a supreme job of legging the family down to the snow in comfort and refinement, especially with that Macintosh stereo, which is so good. One of the anomalies though in the Summit Reserve is that because it has 21-inch wheels, and because it has, I suppose, so much equipment and does weigh more than the others, it's 2,270 kilos in total weight, which you don't feel a lot of the time when you're driving it. It does reduce the brake towing capacity. So if you want to tow anything in a Grand Cherokee L, you need to be looking at the Night Eagle or the Limited, which both have 2.8 ton brake towing capacity. It's only 2.2 in this one, but you know, who knows what the future Trailhawk will have when it mixes higher profile tyres with the adaptive air suspension. I suppose you would hope that it would be more than 2.2, but that remains to be seen. In the meantime, if you want to tow, the two lower models are the ones to go for, and while they don't have the adaptive air suspension of this car, which means they don't quite have that little silky finesse ride quality on top of bumps, there is perhaps a little bit better feel in those two. They certainly don't suffer too much off-road. We really did some full-on off-roading in this vehicle yesterday with the suspension on full ride height and on those 21-inch wheels, and it really did an impressive job, especially with the hill descent control and stuff that the lower spec cars don't have. But even then, they still made the whole entire course as well, and they weren't lifted up. And on the road, they also drive well too. 20-inch wheels on both of those models. Again, quality tyres. I think the one thing that hits home about the Grand Cherokee L is not only the fact that it looks so good, but that it's actually such a good all-rounder, a surprising all-rounder, especially for a large American SUV in Australia. As recently as 2014, Jeep sold 20,000 vehicles in Australia. And while that number is significantly less today, this Grand Cherokee L is about bringing this brand back to the fore and potentially approaching that number again in the future. That's something that Jeep definitely has its sights set on, because they think Australia is tailor-made for cars like this. Now, I know the Grand Cherokee L only comes in a petrol V6 in Australia, but then a lot of its other competitors, including the Hyundai Palisade and other large SUVs that aren't anywhere near as roomy as this, but do approach where the Grand Cherokee L starts in their upper spec forms, are all petrol V6 as well, although they also come in a diesel, and this isn't available in a diesel. But I feel like what's coming in the future will kind of make up for that, certainly with a plug-in hybrid in the 5-seat version. As it stands here though, this Summit Reserve kind of sits in a land of its own. It's between the upper end of these mainstream brands like Hyundai and Kia and Toyota, Honda, whoever else, and below the premium manufacturers, but it has so much stuff inside it. The interior is great, the refinement is excellent, the ride quality is really good, it even has a surprising level of driver appeal, and yet this Summit Reserve here, with the air suspension and the suspension lift and all that stuff, is actually surprisingly excellent off-road as well. But as it stands, in terms of presence and class, this Grand Cherokee L, and particularly in the Summit Reserve, is just a really likable, good thing. If you haven't subscribed, please do so below the video, hit the notification bell, and tell us what you think about the Jeep Grand Cherokee L and Jeep's positioning of this car, or about chasing cars. Thanks for watching.